Alright, for today's critical thought, we have an interesting topic. I want to talk about the basics of procedurally generated game design, or the first steps when you're trying to build a game using procedurally generated content for yourself. Now, we've talked about in the past the pros of having procedurally based content, and when it works, it can deliver a whole lot of replayability and variety to a game. It's been a cornerstone of everything from Path of Exile, Diablo, Spelunky, Binding of Isaac. But what's very interesting is that we're seeing this in non-RPG heavy games, and that's going to kind of be a second part for today's critical thought. But to quickly summarize for those of you new, the difference between procedurally and randomly generated content comes down to how the game builds it. Randomly based content will usually refer to if the game is basically picking from a set of knowns or hard values, or the variance is essentially window dressing. It's the idea of having either a fiery axe or a flaming axe. Again, the name, there may be some variable there, but what you're doing is not changing. When it comes to many games that feature randomly generated content, it could be something as simple as saying there are 5 levels you can play in, but only 2 are going to be chosen at random for each playthrough. Now, procedurally based or procedurally generated content is when the game will literally build something based on a set of instructions hard or programmed by the game designer, or what's commonly referred to as the algorithm for the game. And in this case, the game itself will generate unique instances or items or levels or anything at will or at the time of play. This essentially means that you never know what you're going to get in any given situation. Now, really good examples of this, as we've talked about, would be a game like Spelunky. In Spelunky, you have the hard values such as the biome, what enemies will appear, what possible events, and then the game will just use that to generate a level based on the specifications by designer Derek Yu. And we talked about doing my dissection of the game. Now, with that said though, when it comes to creating or understanding how procedural generation works, it's built on the number of hard variables you're going to have in your game. The hard variables are essentially the modifiers, the variances. If you've played any ARPG, it's all those prefixes: lightning, speedy, fiery, frozen, you name it. Essentially, the hard variables are what the game will choose when they're trying to build the world, the item, the enemy, you name it. When you look at, for instance, Diablo 3 is probably a really good example we'll talk about today. The rare and elite enemy classes are procedurally built based on whatever passive modifiers Blizzard program. So you have stuff like Juggernaut, Healthlink, Mordor, Avenger, and so on and so forth. And each one of those modifiers, again, can be chosen as the game is generating the enemy. The same goes for when it's building gear. Based on what variables or prefixes it chooses, will determine the state of the whatever item it wants to generate. Now, there are elements that are more locked in terms of what can be chosen, such as legendary or set items. If the game rolls a set item, then what it's going to choose is going to be a little bit more fine-tuned compared to just a generic magic or rare item. Now, with that said though, when it comes to generating or creating procedurally based design, you as a designer have to figure out what are going to be these values or these variables that the game will pull from. And again, when we say variables, we can choose just any hard element, from an enemy type to specific events, the biomes, art assets, you name it. But it's important to have a clear set of instructions and a clear set of values for the game to pull from. If you don't define it well enough, you can end up with these mishmashed levels. And you can see this in a lot of games that make use of procedurally based design, but it's not a refined form of it. This is when you'll have a level where you'll have ladders that go off nowhere, staircases that just like stop and start at will, or you'll have like a wall and then you'll have like just a random door or environmental object in that room. It looks like essentially like an MC Escher nightmare come alive. Now, the other part about this and what I want to talk about and what makes this very interesting for procedurally generated design is how we're seeing a more streamlined approach in games without having the hard RPG values. And the two examples I want to talk about are Shadows of Mordor and what we've been told regarding XCOM 2's expansion that's coming out, I believe, by the end of this month, for those of you watching this at the time of posting. Now, Shadows of Mordor features a very amazing system known as the Nemesis system. And when I do my dissecting design of the game at some point, we may just spend it entirely on that one system alone, because it really is a brilliant way to add replayability to a genre that can get very repetitive. But how it works is, when the game, or in Shadows of Mordor, you have two types of enemies. You have the generic Tolkien-based monsters, your orcs, those cat lion things, trolls, and so on. And then you have the named leaders of Sauron's armies, his lieutenants, captains, generals, the guys all the way at the top, the war chiefs. And what the game does is, instead of just hard or predefining every enemy in the game, it builds them procedurally using the Nemesis system. How it works is, you have the basic structure of the enemy, their appearance and their name, and then the game will pull from a set of hard variables in terms of passive modifiers to this enemy, and there's both good and bad ones. And what they do is, by basically doing it like this, by choosing these random, they will essentially procedurally build these enemies. So you may run into a named orc who has immunity to fire, but weak towards range. Or another one who won't flee from combat, but may be afraid of explosions. And these values by themselves don't seem all that complicated. But when you throw it into a game that's built on sandbox gameplay, it adds another dimension to the game design. Suddenly, you can't just, teleport in and kill every enemy site, or I should say immediately. Instead, it becomes about, okay, this enemy is strong against X, Y, and Z, but weak against A, B, and C. How do I work that into my routine? And it creates these emergent situations where you're trying to stalk the enemy and get into the right position to exploit those weaknesses. And as enemies level up, or as they go up in strength, the game will also, I think, pull from stronger positive modifiers, such as those that make them easier to enrage, or they may just pull less negative. So as the enemy grows and you keep them alive, they're going to keep collecting these modifiers. In essence, you're basically having an enemy who is growing and improving themselves along with the player. And with the Nemesis system, this essentially creates these enemies who are going to essentially stalk you from beginning to middle to end if you let them live long enough. And in XCOM 2, which I remember watching a live stream with Jake Solomon, I think he said that they were heavily inspired by the system with the new alien hunters. And these characters, again, when they show up, they're going to have a randomly generated or randomly pulled set of modifiers. Maybe one enemy will have resistance to Overwatch, but maybe they'll be weak to sniper rifles. And then as they keep appearing and disappearing and reappearing throughout the game, they're going to keep collecting these pool of modifiers. And again, we're essentially procedurally generating an enemy type. And that enemy type in one game is going to be different from the next game and the next and so on. But how you're playing the game is not changing. It's basically what the game's going to throw at you that will. And that is the beauty of procedurally generated design. Because it practically means that as long as the game can pull in the variables, you're never going to run into the same exact situation twice. Now, with that said, though, when we talked about this before, it's important to point out the negative of procedurally generated design. As we said a few minutes ago, there's a very big difference between good and bad procedural design. And getting it right requires a designer to really develop their algorithm and know exactly what they want the game to generate at any given time. Now, when I say exactly, I mean in terms of what variables it's going to pull. Again, the beauty and nightmare of procedurally generated design is that you never know 100% what's going to come. With Shadows of Mordor, for instance, you can run into situations where the game will spawn an enemy who has no combat finisher weaknesses. And then how are you supposed to deal with them easily? Or you may get lucky and they'll spawn a high-level enemy who can be killed by just shooting them in the head with a bow and arrow. And when it comes to procedurally generated design, you have to build a big enough pool of variables for the game to choose from. Because the shorter the pool, the less variances that you'll have. So if you only have like 2, fire or ice, well, you're not going to be able to really generate a whole lot of variety. And this goes back to the idea of randomly generated content as more or less window dressing. But that will have to be for another talk because that is a major topic in of itself. But to wrap up today's critical thought, building procedurally generated content is always going to be about just what modifiers you want the game to pull from. And it's important to, while you can't, again, 100% predict what it's going to pull from, you have to be careful with how you design things. Because for people like me or who are unlucky, we can always run into that situation where the game will just spawn an enemy that has no weaknesses whatsoever and just kills the character immediately. So you have to put in those considerations. This is why with Shadows of Mordor, and I assume with Shadow of War and with XCOM 2, that the game will always pull weakness modifiers, or a way to counterbalance the strength it's giving the enemy. But I really hope, I just banged the table there, I really hope that this is a sign with XCOM 2 that more designers are going to look at the Nemesis system as inspiration for generating enemies and generating situations. Because if you can make things different enough, it can do a lot to alleviate that kind of sense of repetitiveness that we see in action games or open world games when you're just fighting the same generic enemies 50, 100, maybe a few hundred times over the course of play. But what if we have enemies that can have unique abilities, and you never know exactly what you're going to fight? Now, of course, when you do that, you also have to worry about the player's power level at any given time. As we've talked about with roguelike development, you always have to have a plan when it comes to procedurally generated content. You can't have the game just spawn everything and anything at any given time, because that will lead to absolute chaos and completely wreck any semblance of a progression curve. You can have like super overpowered or nightmare modifiers for enemies, but you have to save that for when the time is right. Your game shouldn't spawn on the very first level an enemy who's immune to every possible kind of damage the player could put out at that time. And as we said, you always, when it comes to generating these algorithms, you always think about things in every consideration. But with that said, we'll wrap things up here. For those of you watching this, besides games like Shadow of Mordor and XCOM, can you think of other games that can really make use of a Nemesis system, or games that have already beaten me to the punch and have been using similarities of it when generating enemies? As a quick example, or a quick small example of this, the game I've been playing, Galaxy of Pen and Paper, allows you to procedurally generate quests based on a set of hard values. The contact, the planet, the type of quest you're doing, what enemy you're hunting, stuff like that. But the actual content is still kept so basic that it doesn't really feel different. But it's still a small example of allowing the player or allowing the game to procedurally create something new for them to experience. But Thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know if you have a suggestion for a future Critical Thought or Industry Insight topic, and check back daily for more discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and come back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on game development, be sure to check out game-wisdom.com. Follow me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day. And to help support everything that I do, you can find me on Patreon under GWBycer or Game Wisdom. Your donations can help to keep things running, and we hit some goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy. So, thanks again for watching, and be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design on the Game Wisdom channel.